Hello there, my name's Angela. The National Churches Trust have asked me to produce a series of videos to help the people that care for churches produce better photographs of their church and ultimately get more people exploring churches. So most of the advice I'll be giving you today will apply to most makes of camera and most models of smartphone. If you want very specific advice for your particular model, I suggest that you go to Google or to YouTube and you search, but you also search for the most recent articles, and you can also search specifically for videos on Google to find very, very graphical, very easy to understand help. So now we're going to talk about composition, and one of the biggest aids to composition is the grid, which you can switch on in most smartphones and cameras. It divides the image up into 9 squares, and it gives you an ability to compose your photos according to the rule of thirds. So a lot of people, when they first take photographs, they line up the subject slap bang in the middle of the image, which does make a lot of sense and it makes a pleasing photo. But most photographers would argue that by placing your subject along one of these grid lines, you get a much more interesting final shot. The rule of thirds applies to landscape and portrait photographs. And a good rule to observe when you're taking portraits of people is if you can put the crosshair of that top line where their eyes are, you will generally get a well-composed portrait photograph. The rule of thirds applies also to outdoor photography where your subject is a church that is some distance away. Line the central heart of the church along your grid lines and you'll end up with a much more interesting final photograph. But don't forget to check the outsides to make sure you haven't chopped off the tower. Another technique used by photographers to draw people into their photographs is called leading lines, and this is where an object, usually at the corner of the image, works towards the centre. And the classic example is railway lines, which lead your eye into the heart of the photo. For churches, there's quite a few ways you can do this. For example, you may have the path leading up to your church leading the viewer into the photo. You can also follow the line of your pew, which may lead your viewer into the photograph of your stained glass window. And also, of course, you have the aisle, which is the ultimate leading line, taking a person through the church into the altar. So there are plenty of opportunities to take leading line photographs in churches, and they're a great way to engage your viewer. Another photographic technique, which you often find in magazines and which tailors itself well to promoting your church, is called the flat lay. Now this is where the subject of the photograph are laid out on a table or even the floor, and the photograph is taken directly from above. You may often have seen this used to show the ingredients for a recipe. Now in terms of a church, you could have a backpack with all the items laid out you need to go exploring churches. You could also use a flat lay to promote your church's cake or bake stall by having all the gorgeous cakes laid out on a table with the photograph taken from above. Another very obvious use of the flat lay technique for churches is when you have grave slabs in your church and you want to take a really good crisp photograph of them so that people can actually read that online and find out more about that person's story. Another use of the flat lay technique for churches is if you get your parish records and you have a very interesting page, perhaps from 100 or more years ago. So you can take a flat lay photograph of those records and put them online. And a lot of people, local people and people from a wider area, will be fascinated at that window into the past that flat lay photograph gives you. Another way that photographers add interest to their images is by using foreground interest. Now this is when a photograph is taken over quite a long distance and there is an item very close to the lens and obviously a subject very far away. And the choice here is whether you make the item close to the lens in focus and the subject blurred, but you can still make out what it is, or the other way around. This effect can even be achieved with a smartphone by tapping on the screen and telling it where to focus. So often you will see pictures of churches that are in focus with lovely blurred grass and flowers in the foreground. Or because a lot of churches have very decorative gates, you can take a photograph of your church through that gate and choose whether to have the gate in focus or the church in focus. And again, my advice would be to you to try both, and then when you get home, see which one you prefer. Now, we all know that a framed photograph is very pleasing to the eye, But what you can also do to achieve this is look for frames that exist in the natural environment so that you include the frame in the photo you're taking. For example, you can often have gravestones with cut-out areas, and you can poke your lens through that cut-out area to create a picture of your church with a stone frame around it. Also, many Gothic buildings provide you with open archways that you can use to create this framed effect. And also, nature is very good at providing a frame of foliage with which you can take your photograph of your church inside that. This again puts the message across that your church has a beautiful setting as well as being a beautiful building in itself. Another way you can take a really interesting photograph of your church, which is quite easy to do, is make use of the reflections in water. Now, you may be lucky enough to have a church that's located near a river or a lake, but if you don't, you can actually nip round with a watering can and find an indentation in your pathway and make the puddle yourself, and then get on the floor and capture the photograph of your church reflected in a lovely still puddle. It's not that difficult to do, but it's incredibly effective. And now I'm going to talk about taking photographs from different angles. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the bird's eye view. A lot of churches have a very privileged position of having a tower that people can go up and get an unusual view of the surrounding village or town. Make use of that view. People will be fascinated to know what it looks like from up there. So get up your tower, take as many photographs as you can, and get those photographs out there. It could also be worth inviting a group of local photographers up your tower, and then you'll get a range of good quality photographs to use. Many churches also have galleries allowing another elevated view of the church interior that people will really enjoy looking at. The opposite to the bird's eye view is the worm's eye view. This is particularly useful when photographing children and animals. It's very good to get on the same level with them, and it makes the photographs much more emotive. The final unusual view that you may want to consider when you're photographing your church is what I call the dead worm's eye view. Many churches have fantastic, gorgeous ceilings, and taking a photograph directly upwards of that ceiling will make people stop and stare because they won't quite work out what it is at first. And the process of them working out what it is makes them more engaged in your church and more likely to go and explore your church. Another reason why photographers love churches is because they are full of symmetry, and symmetry is incredibly pleasing to the eye. So make sure that you capture every symmetrical element of your church, from the straight view down the aisle to perhaps the Gothic windows if you have them, to the symmetry that may be in your stained glass. And make sure that you switch your grid on to allow you to get the balance between the symmetry absolutely perfect each time.